Hello again, and welcome back to the Cybersecurity Advisors Networks, or CYAN's Secure in Mind series of video and podcast conversations. This is a collection of chats and interviews and fireside chats and panels with people with something interesting to say around the global information and, more specifically, cybersecurity industry. We talk to various types of stakeholders, including engineers, scientists, academics, politicians, and other experts. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Hugo Tarrida, who has recently finished his master's degree at King's College, or King's College, I think it's in London. Let you talk about that. I'm getting the names probably all messed up. And we're proud to have Hugo as one of the participants in CYAN's first cybersecurity mentorship program episodes, and he's part of the pilot group, and we're just wrapping these up. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about Hugo's work, about his studies and his projects, particularly with a focus on cyber warfare, hybrid warfare, and related topics. And I'll stop here, and if you'd like to introduce yourself, give us a little bit of background, talk a little bit about your studies, and then we can start talking about some of the content of what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. So I did my master's at King's College London, and I did my thesis on hybrid warfare and cyber warfare and the impact it has on security, both national and international. It has a big focus on it because it's a growing topic, something that's been going on for now some time, that's starting to be seen more and more by larger countries, but also smaller actors who are being able to get involved into creating damage, chaos, but also just gathering information from a cheaper way than traditional methods such as like spying and stealth. And well, I'm very interested. I did my thesis on it. And well, I'm happy to be here and talk about it as much as I am able to.
Excellent. Thanks very much. I'm very happy that we're actually having this conversation because it's a topic that's very dear to me. Especially in relationship to the public-private aspects of collective cyber defense. In Europe, especially right now, we're seeing, we've had a history of, especially, but not only Russian, whether it's disinformation campaigns, direct interference, direct cyber attacks, both by government affiliated and government run organizations, as well as I think government tolerated organizations. And there's been this growth in understanding of generally critical infrastructure as a major point of weakness of every developed economy. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the trends that you're seeing, about some of the research that you've done in terms of what the recent developments are about attacks, attackers, methodologies, and what the drivers behind these things are? I know it's a very broad question, but just wanted to kind of give you an opening to introduce some of the main focal areas of this subject matter.
Yeah, as you said, most of like these attacks in Europe tend to be Russian state or by Russian groups allowed in the state, which is a trend that has been going on since as early as 2008 with like the Estonian attack, which was one of the first cases of like cyber warfare. And obviously it was not only Russia as like a state, but also state actors and other like private companies, as you say, working together with public in order to attack. And also mentioning about what you said, critical infrastructure. It has been growing in the sense that there's more critical infrastructure, or what is more considered more amount of it, which is something good as it provides better infrastructure itself, but also abilities for countries to grow, but also is a point of vulnerability because it's larger area to protect. And also considered a point of gravity. It's also considered centers of gravity itself. So if they're attacked, they can be highly damaged and highly detrimental for the country, both its own stability, economy, but also its own ability to rule and keep the state and the peace within the country itself. And obviously, it is a great point of focus in cyber attacks, for example, in cyber warfare. Once you're able to damage critical infrastructure, the damage might not be permanent, but it tends to be long-term, tends to be very hard to recover from it. And obviously it's something where countries are increasingly focusing in order to protect in both cyber aspects, but also physical aspects, in the sense of For example, nuclear power plants, you have to have the cyber defense itself, but also you have to have perimeter controls, because in the end, a normal attack can also damage these critical infrastructures, which is something that tends to be overseen or less researched. And it's something that has to be really kept in mind regarding like government perspective. And this is also being helped in order like protection wise by private companies working together with the government to ensure they are able to function properly, and also have like recovery plans in order if something goes wrong, they're able to still run and provide the necessary means.
From the perspective, I think of I'm going to, this is obviously very biased towards the more Western liberal democracies. The primary four adversaries we've seen on the geopolitical cyber warfare stage have been Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea in no particular order. All of these groups have had a variety of different techniques, a variety of different objectives. With the North Koreans, it's been sabotage, such as in the case of Sony Pictures, allegedly, as well as theft. With China, it's very often related to Chinese, politics. Russians, very often disinformation or outright attacks. Iran, the same, but more with a Gulf focus. Can you talk a little bit about we're hearing a lot about these kind of classic usual suspect actors, but cyber warfare is obviously a capability that most mature modern defense organizations have been pursuing, not only defensively but also offensively. Do you have any comments you'd like to make about some observations you've seen? What are Western militaries up to in terms of maybe countermeasures, preemptive or strike back? Obviously, without going too much into specifics, but are there some trends that we're seeing, for example, across NATO, across Five Eyes that you've observed?
Yeah, like obviously since like the first cyber warfare war per se, cyber war, which was the Russian-Estonian one, the US started a trend which was creating a cyber command itself within their own countries, specifically to protect, create cyber defenses for critical infrastructure for national security, but also to be able to develop cyber offensive capabilities. Something that's been a trend since in the Western world, in the sense that, for example, the UK followed quickly after, and the rest of Europe did as well. This also was then translated to NATO, creating their own specific cyber group in order to both protect and attack. But then, although the trend is mostly focused on Western countries, it's also seen in what you said, the main attackers, which could be Russia, Iran, China, North Korea. For example, Iran created their own cyber command, or sort of cyber command, in order to conduct these special operations, in order to gain information, extract the sensitive data, and also try to attack and undermine their enemies. Something that, for example, China has been doing to a lesser extent. So China has focused more on espionage rather than actually creating damage. Something that to a certain extent has been very, very beneficial to China. They've been doing it very well, with huge amounts of information being stolen in terms of economy and mainly technology. But also there was this one case, I can't remember the exact name, where China was able to introduce a chip within a manufacturing line, and it was shipped to the US, and the product was sold all around the world. They were able to collect that information and bring it back to China. And it was a project that took a lot of time to actually go and produce, but the effects for China were extremely beneficial, as it took several years for the US to actually realize this was going on. This huge, massive exfiltration of information was happening, because in the end, each country has their own perspective, their own way of doing it. And although one might say that's more or less beneficial or accurate and efficient, they all adapt to what the criteria is and what they want to achieve. So, for example, Russia tends to be more aggressive, because I personally believe they want to show a more aggressive stance, a more position of power. Rather, with China, for example, they would tend to be more in the background. They want to know what's going on and be prepared without actually being noticed as much.
Well, their objectives are also fundamentally different. I mean, the Chinese tend to have both economic interests and what they perceive as the integrity of their own national interest and integrity, whereas your Russians can be very, to some degree, very the flag in my background, very expansionist and playing a zero-sum game, the kind of Alexander Dugin school of geopolitics. What hurts my enemy is good for me.
Exactly. I completely agree, and that obviously creates different perspectives to creating cyber strategies, cyber defense, and even which is happening nowadays, mainly like through NATO and NATO allied countries, which is military exercises incorporating cyber structures and cyber activities and offensive capabilities as well. So they are starting to incorporate both of these in different ways in order to achieve a more potential military and more efficient way of attacking, both in traditional methods, which would be like using the army, and more untraditional, which could be through just cyber means, which is hacking or just disinformation campaigns, as you said, in some cases as Russia. And this is being incorporated because it started to be seen as a larger threat. And obviously, it's a greater problem as countries have to adapt more to avoid these negative consequences if done to them. And this impact is obviously cannot be completely estimated, as one country can do the same as another and the results may be completely different. So they're just trying to prepare as much as possible for something that might happen without knowing what the real consequences might be or what the impact might be.
I think it's a good time. I'm glad you mentioned Estonia in 2008. I think it's a good point to bring up the NATO, the Collective Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn. That's been a one of several NATO affiliated or NATO aligned think tanks with a focus on precisely the understanding that attacks on critical infrastructure and various partner countries can affect the stability of the whole alliance and their economies even in peacetime. What was a real eye opener for me, I went to a couple of their locked shields exercises, trying to bring the financial sector as a collective in, not just as a simulated part of critical infrastructure, critical industry. And I was really surprised at the level of sensitivity among the military guys by very, very unexpected things, such as the use of the term attack. Right? If you say cyber attack in the private sector, that's what it is. It's a common occurrence. It happens all the time. The moment with some of the military guys, you said attack, there were certain connotations because in the military mind, the term attack signifies something that requires a proportional, potentially even violent or destructive response. In your studies, I have my own experiences on this, my own views on this, but I'd love to hear from you. What kinds of tensions and maybe incompatibilities even have you seen between, the civilians, right? The sneaky civilians in the private sector and the military guys who are trying to basically engage and build national defense in the face of geopolitical adversaries in terms of culture, in terms of capabilities, and what are some of the challenges to work together to strengthen these capabilities?
So, for example, the military tends to be, like, obviously because of the nature, it is more secretive. So both cyber operations they're conducting are only known years after, not even decades sometimes, but also what they develop, whether it's like security systems or even offensive capabilities, tend to be kept secret until the necessary moment to use them. And this goes in hand with what you were talking about, the connotation of attack. In the military sense, it's very, as you said, like physical, somewhat violent in a certain sense. While in the private sector, it tends to be, they infiltrated our system, or they're going to conduct a malware attack or ransomware attack. But within the military, that idea still exists, but it's more different of how is it going to affect and impact the national scheme? How's it going to affect, for example, in terms of communication within the military? How are we going to be able to communicate between the Navy and, like, for example, the Army and move troops around? That kind of sense, obviously, is very different. But as we've seen, for example, with the Ukrainian war, both private and public sector can join in order to protect in cases of need. So, for example, Russia was conducting heavy cyber attacks in Ukrainian critical infrastructure. So avoiding government communications, like trying to bring down electricity and water and so on to the whole of the country. And it was partly because of the government avoiding it, but also private sectors all around the world, mainly Western, stepping up and saying, hey, if you do this, it will help, and even conducting that kind of help. So the ability to work together is there, and also the efficiency and actually proven methods can be seen from there. But obviously, they're still very different. So the private sector still thinks more in terms of economy, how it's going to damage the own like the company, the economy, the company, the reputation, even how that's going to have an impact then in sales or within partners and shareholders. When the army tends to focus, as I said, more on national level or even sometimes international, if it's organizations such as NATO, they try to have a step back, take a step back, view the whole issue, view a whole situation, see how to actually solve it, but also in the future without the need of involving military means, as least for as long as possible. From my experience, from what I've researched, companies tend to want to solve the problem quickly. Obviously, I've tried to avoid it in the future, but the main issue is solve the problem quickly to avoid economic loss rather than solve it permanently in the long term.
I thought it was a very, I mean, I wrote a whole paper on the topic of public-private cooperation, even in quote unquote peacetime. And my the underlying theorem was that as far as the private sector was concerned, until things actually start exploding, we don't care who the adversary is. Well, obviously we do in terms of TTPs and being able to, prepare and recover from. But generally, we don't really care. And I found it really fascinating to see the differences in cultural approaches and motivations, like what you just talked about. Especially because, again, from the private sector perspective, we've gone through this already once with law enforcement, right? Because of the military sensitive nature, there's a trust issue very often. These are amateurs. We don't want them involved in these national issues, and we have to be very careful. But we've already seen this in terms of combating cybercrime together with Interpol, Europol, and national agencies. So I thought it's been fascinating to see this kind of growing realization in the military cyber command structures that there is a need to increasingly involve all aspects of society in trust groups and preparation, but also in understanding what the recovery capabilities and resilience are. And I think it's a really good point that you made that, I mean, if you're a private company, you're motivated by shareholder value and profit, essentially, right? So how do you reconcile these? Well, on the one hand, we're not at war. We don't have a war economy. So we're not going to mobilize you and your company in the national defense. But on the other hand, the attacks are still flying in the background, right? And they're affecting everybody. So it is in your material interest to participate in these collective defense structures, all the while having to build these kind of trust mechanisms and these cultural interchanges between, the defense guys, the military guys, and the private sector people.
Yeah, I also wanted to add to a point you were saying, is that also the private sector tends to obviously improve and push for more like technological improvements. So they tend to be always the first ones to find new and better ways in order to benefit them and benefit their profits. But obviously this can be translated to the military. So obviously also adding on, this cooperation is extremely beneficial. And companies need to try to understand that although they're trying and seeking profit, they can also try at the same time to help like national or international stability and like safety. And on the other hand as well, military and governments have to try to bring that kind of expertise into their own sectors, whether it's by hiring the people itself or by talking with the companies and actually trying to develop this kind of relationship you were talking about of mutual trust and cooperation in order to, if the need comes, to actually work together or to a certain extent share information. So this exists to a certain extent. For example, in Spain, there's companies which are considered like critical infrastructure or have very critical needs in terms of government or for the well-being of the country itself. And they have special like talks and contracts and so on with the government, ensuring that they are one side protected by the government itself, and the other that they will help the government if the time needs. So this kind of cooperation, I do think it exists, it helps, it's beneficial, but the extent of it, I am honestly unaware of how big it is. And also, I think it depends on personality itself. So one individual who might be very distrustful of the government or might not believe in the government or might not care, might just avoid working with the government in the mid and long term, rather than trying to like change the.
Sorry, if I may, the fear in my own experience is not so much with government per se, but it's with regulators. And for example, if you're a financial services firm, there's very often a worry, sometimes legitimate, that if you report an incident, then the regulator is going to come to you and say, "Well, you didn't do your job, so you didn't engage in due care, so we're going to fine you." And I think that's why it's been so fascinating to see these regulatory requirements in both the EU and the US and other jurisdictions about things like mandatory incident reporting, right? So it's very interesting you mentioned Spain as well, because I don't know how it is now, but a couple of years ago, I've heard from a number of people in key Spanish corporations, cyberdefense organizations, that they didn't really feel like engaging with INCIBE, so the National Cybersecurity Agency, because they felt there was a take, and not a give back. Whereas if you look at cultures like the Netherlands or the UK and a few others, they're extremely good at this very, very, even the Americans, right? Extremely good at this very constructive bilateral multi-stakeholder dialogue and fostering this atmosphere of constructive exchange. Obviously nobody's perfect, but I think it's good to learn from each other from the ones that have really got this maturity already well in progress.
Yeah, I completely agree in the sense. Obviously regulators, so when I meant government, well, it was regulator, so that's the correct word. Inspire fear because of the economic sanctions that may happen, but obviously states and countries have to understand that what their companies are going through, so like cyber attacks and so on, can happen on a larger scale to the country itself. So it should not companies should not be fined, or at least depending on the cyber attack they received, because it might be something new, something they were not prepared for, and something which the government might now be able to prepare for thanks to that company actually suffering it first. And also then I also agree with the sense that governments tend, at least for example in Spain, to take more than they give. And that creates this animosity towards working together and towards trying to actually spread information and share information for the well-being. And obviously it has something that has to change, something that has to upgrade and improve in the sense of both the government seeing that they cannot have only a one-way relationship with the private sector, but also maybe the private sector trying to understand that the government looks more than just for the profit, something that they might be not so keen to see. But obviously, if a government only takes, which is like the case of Spain in many cases, then it creates this.
It's a horrible generalization. It's purely anecdotal. So I don't want to drag, INCIBE's or any other agency's name through the mud, just to be clear here, right? Hello, we love you.
But in a sense, like regulators and governments around the world tend to take a lot more than they give. But if you try to reach, as you said, this equal relationship, then it will always also improve better. It will work better and will allow both private and public sector to move forward in a cooperation way, in such a way that works for both and it's beneficial. And it's something that's going to take time and something that might not even happen, but it should.
That's the important thing, is the time, I think, because trust takes a lot of time. The crazy thing about this is that I personally am not familiar with a single globally, I'm sure there are some, instance of a regulator fining a company that was attacked just for being attacked. There have been several, especially in the US, when they've been breached because of negligence, right? But that's not the vast majority of I've encountered this in this threat actor just trying to hit me. And it would be so much more valuable if, for example, your national cybersecurity agency and in turn your national intelligence and defense agencies could have access to this information as part of tracking and correlating, for example, state actor campaigns. What I want to touch on in terms of this whole giving back and coordination thing, and I'm at risk of making the Americans sound, I'm Swiss, by the way, just by my accent, so I can talk, but making them sound perfect. They're not. They've got a lot to learn, but they do have this, I think, constructive cooperation with CISA and even the Defense Department down pretty well through Homeland Security. One of the major issues I've seen in Europe is that even with the growth of critical or crisis coordination initiatives like Cyclone, right, and the increasing mandate for ENISA, there is still a very, very heavy focus on EU member state mechanisms, and across, beyond the EU for EFTA and its neighbors and friends. There's also this very, very strong focus on the national cybersecurity agencies and the militaries, but not a lot of encouragement for, again, the body of what is vulnerable and crunchy and the attack surface, i.e. the private sector, to really coordinate across borders. Good example in my home country, in Switzerland, one of the issues is that the national critical cyber coordination body will simply not pick up the phone to companies in Switzerland who are not Swiss firms. They're not considered part of Swiss infrastructure because national secrecy, right? And especially when we start talking about, well, we're all sharing these kinds of cyber attacks. Well, shouldn't we be talking to each other, not just at this high level among national certs and defense agencies, but really encouraging this kind of multi-stakeholder, multi-dimensional, operational information sharing and collective defense?
I agree. So, obviously what you're saying, each cooperation should not be only at a high level. It should also be at the very bottom of it. So private companies talking to one another, saying what kind of vulnerabilities they have or how to solve them, how to protect each other, and so on. But also not, as you're saying, not a bit within one country. Obviously, the EU is considered one big area where cooperation should be encouraged. But what you're saying is quite shockingly that sense that cybersecurity is something that's growing in importance. Companies are not actually being helped by other states outside their own. It's something that obviously is going to be detrimental in the long run, because the more insight you have to how better to protect yourself, it's going to improve both at the national level, but also at continental EU level. Because in the end, cooperation is the base of the EU, whether it's economic, political, and so on. And if at the basic level this is not existent, then the top is going to crack in the end, or it's going to have obviously big flaws that are going to have a big impact. So I do agree on that. It's something that has to be solved. And on my experience, I haven't seen much of it, but obviously companies try to and will always work for their own benefit. And if that means talking to other states, other countries, other companies in order to protect themselves, they will do it. And that will be beneficial for everyone. So that should be to some extent encouraged, and also they should be helped in doing so.
The encouraging sign, I think, is that the ISACs model is really picking up steam, especially, but not only in Europe, across multiple critical sectors. And the Commission and ENISA seem to have understood, as the Americans did quite a while ago, and some other countries like the Dutch, that this is a good way to foster industry cooperation. But there's still a lot of gaps in industry talks among each other. Government agencies talk among each other, but this kind of cross-border public-private cooperation seems to be lagging a bit. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about another aspect of cyber warfare, hybrid warfare that's very near and dear to me right now, and that's disinformation. Especially right now with the Middle East going to hell in a handbasket, Russia, Ukraine already, and already we've had a lot of background noise from the Chinese and many others. Can you talk a little bit about how defense agencies are seeing disinformation trolls as kind of a weaponized way to undermine stability, trust in institutions, as a way to weaken their adversaries?
So disinformation is a very big weapon, very, very useful if done properly. So its main objective tends to be to, first of all, disorganize and disorient the like population in sense of you don't know what the truth is, so you don't know what to believe in. But then also it can create dissent within the country. It can create chaos and problems, which are further than just information. And this would be like the biggest aim. And obviously countries try to avoid this. States and governments see this as a big fear, as a big problem that has to be solved. So for example, Russia has been doing this for a very long time. So from my point of view, they're pretty good at doing so. But also the problem is countries are now, well, now for the last decade or so, trying to solve this problem. They're trying to see how to fight it because in the end, once you publish, for example, disinformation campaigns, it's hard to stop it in the sense that once it's out there, once people start to read it, once people start to see it, it's hard to change their mind. Mainly because of the bias of the first thing you see, the first thing you read is what's going to stick to you. This then creates the problem of how do you change the perspective to what the real issue is or what the real problem is rather than what you've been fed, which might not be accurate. And obviously there's different ways to combat this, to change it, but one might just be actually being a truthful government. So have first stance, the trust of the people and know that what you're saying is going to be trusted by at least the majority of the people. So once a disinformation campaign comes out, you can actually publicly come out and say, hey, this is false, this is wrong, this is the true story. And then people might actually believe it. However, this is not the case for many countries. So the issue would be that one way to fight it could be actually just trying to fight it when the first signals come out, which is also hard to actually find and realize when it is. So it might just be one piece of, for example, disinformation, or it might be a whole attack and campaign targeting one issue. And also one of the biggest methods I would say would be just to actually fight disinformation with real information. So this is actually very hard because the amount of disinformation that can be created and distributed is much more than the reality and the truth because there's like limited amounts. But trying to do that might be beneficial or might actually try to solve or improve the problem itself.
Some really good points in there. I mean, I'll send you a paper I wrote on the topic. I'm curious to hear what you think about it. I think one of the big problems is the asymmetric nature of return on disinformation warfare investments. You know, you can create a lot of chaos with a comparatively small amount of resources, especially if you as some commentators have put forward, you're exploiting existing societal divisions. I want to wrap up slowly and give you a chance to make any comments, any predictions, any higher level observations, as well as to give a shout out to any initiatives or programs or publications that you'd like people to know about in this context. So the floor is yours. Anything additional that you'd like to share that you think would be useful and interesting learning in this topic?
So obviously learn the impact more than cyber itself, hybrid. That's something we talked about at the beginning, but something that's going to be increasingly important, something that's going to be increasingly seen. And for example, was seen in Ukraine now with the war. It might be seen with Israel against Hamas, but it's also going to be seen more with bigger states, which has both good military capabilities and good cyber capabilities as well. So that would be a big issue to watch out and maybe read and learn more. And also insist on how it's going to impact both at the national and international level. So one country can actually benefit a lot from using hybrid, while another using hybrid methods cannot be as beneficial or might have very weak impact. And also I'd like to mention, I guess, final wrap up, that cyber is still, and hybrid is still going to grow in the sense that it's going to become more important. So the world has become more interconnected through digital means, and it's going to keep doing so. So everyone has a phone, everyone has a computer, every company has a network. They have to protect and has to be protected in order for your own personal data or information not to be stolen, or to receive like state or no state actors attacks. All of that has to be taken into account. It's a growing area. It's a growing theme and topic. And it's something that's going to be more impactful, whether for the better or worse, because of both globalization and also increasing global tensions. It might have detrimental effects. I'm just going to leave it at that.
I really firmly believe that we are in at a point where we need to start, even more than we have, reevaluating the boundary between war and not war, and maybe even, begin to have an understanding of a constant background noise of conflict and attacks, especially given, as you put it correctly, everything is so interconnected, interdependent, and thus to some degree vulnerable. With that, I want to wrap up. I want to thank you very, very kindly for taking the time. And I look forward to welcoming you to the Cyan community. For everybody who is interested in this, I will put everything that Hugo would like me to share, including hopefully your paper, any publications, in the video descriptions. It's awesome. And a few other interesting links. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with us. Check us out at cybersecurityadvisors.network. If you have any suggestions for topics for these videos, if you'd like to participate, if you'd like to join, we'd love to hear from you. With that, I want to wrap up. Hugo, thank you very, very much for your time. I wish you a pleasant evening. I think you're in the UK right now?
No, I'm in Spain.
Oh, you're in Spain. Okay, so it's getting cold for you as well. I'm in Spain as well. So thanks very much, and I hope to talk to you soon. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you very much. Bye.